Hello. Today we're going to show you how to create a dynamic measure and a dynamic dimension for a dashboard. When I say dynamic, I mean having one field that allows the user to view by whichever measure they'd like to and whichever dimension they'd like to as a pre-selected item. By the end of it, we should come up with something that looks a little bit like this dashboard. Come on. You see here that we can select a dimension and select a measure. So if I want to see my categories and I want to see the sales, I can view that, and we can actually drill down further because this is a hierarchy. We can drill into the subcategories for this categorical view down to the products. But right now we're just going to start by building these two pieces up here. And later on, we'll get into how to really take it apart and build something with hierarchies. So for right now, we're going to create a couple of parameters. We have to think about what we want to be able to offer our users. So I'm going to create one parameter. You can right-click anywhere in the left-hand side of the screen, or you can go to the top and just say Create Parameter. A parameter is a way for us to be able to allow the user to select something that's not necessarily in the data set, and we can create calculations that use that. And I like to, for this parameter, I'm going to call this Choose Your Measure. And what I usually, you can comment, and it's a very good idea if you work with other developers. You always want to code like the guy coming behind you is a psychopath and knows where you live. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this and call it dynamic measures. I know that that's pretty easy, but you know, as you get more involved, that commenting is more and more important. And I create all of my parameters, I create as floats or integers where I can, because it's a lot faster than creating them as strings. These are the types of items that you can select. So, and I'm going to show a list. And so what you can do is I want to allow the user to select any of these measures. So I'm going to have 4 items. So go ahead and go down the value sheet. 1, 2, 3, 4. And on the display side, because the user doesn't know what those values mean, I can actually call those out. Discount, profit, quantity, and sales. Quantity and sales. And I'll do another one. You can even copy and just duplicate the same one and edit it and say choose your dimension. Now this one can get a little tricky, and the way I'd handled that in our example was to create hierarchies. But say let's just start with something easy and say that I either want to view the category, the region, the state, or the product. And it doesn't have to match the number of values from one to another, but we do need to remember what we've selected here. And a good way to do that, on your sheet right here, you can just right click that parameter and say show parameter control. and go to that parameter and say single value list, so that you can remember exactly what order and what values you've put in that parameter. I'm going to do that for both of them. So parameters are great for reasons I've already talked about, but the only bad thing, and the thing that you do need to remember with parameters, is if you're basing them off of a field, they don't automatically update as your data does. So I can actually have a choose your dimension and just list all the states if I wanted to. But when one state, we don't have to worry about with states, but if one state left or came in, then I wouldn't have that data. A better idea would have been the customer name, to use that as an example. Excuse me. But the when you use a parameter, you have to tie it to a filter for it to even show anything. So now we're going to create those filters. So I'm going to right click here again and say create calculated field. Drag it over, it popped up on the other sheet. And this is what a calculation looks like. You'll see your typing pane here on the side and your cheat sheet here on the right hand side. But if you don't need that, you can actually hit this little button and hide it. So for the first one, I'm going to call this selected dimension. And you can either do this a couple of different ways. You can write an if statement or a case statement. I find case statements are a little bit easier because you can add to them and it's a little less verbiage. So I'm going to say case. Think of it like as what you're wanting to talk about. You say in case they've chosen the dimension for the parameter, choose your dimension, and your parameters will show up in your calculation as purple items. When one, then category. As you start typing it out, it does pre-select, autofill. 1, 2, then region. 1, 3, then state. The bad thing is if you don't make sure that these things are lined up, then you'll regret it later. When you put this viz out there and when they've selected state but category showing up, they get really confused. And all calculated fields, if you're doing it where things have to meet a certain criteria, they end with the end word. If you're doing something, if it's just a Boolean or something, you don't need to have an end word. So I hit OK. And so let's see what that does. If I pull it over to the side and I pull category out here, I can see it's the same thing. And let's go ahead and check. Let's put region, state. You remember we did that with in our last video. We actually just pulled in Tennessee. So let me go, and if I did not show this, but if you right select or right click on the data source, you can go to your data source filters and get rid of that filter. Once you hit OK, now you see all the data sets. And because I had aliased Tennessee as TN, now I also need to change that alias back. So if I scroll down, I can see that here. I select clear aliases and OK. So now when you see Tennessee, it's spelled out. And I want to pull over. This is not something that you need to do. It's really ugly. I'm not going to do it. No, it's not a good practice. So I can at least leave it just category and region for now. So if you select region, you see this field, the selected dimensions field actually changes to your region. And because it's the first one in the column, it's now reordered everything for category for the next column. You select state and select product. Now you've got a fully functioning dynamic dimension. Now let's do the same thing for our measures. So we can either just duplicate this field. I will, because it's the same format for both. And you see now it's giving you an error message. Well, that's because some of our fields that we're wanting to use are actually continuous numbers, and some of them are actually categories. So you either need to have one or the other. Some of these are floats and these are strings. So let's see, quantity, but when we get this filled out, we won't have that issue anymore because they'll all be integers or floats. So select OK. So now my selected measure, because I made a copy of the dimension, it actually thinks that it is a dimension, but it is instead a measure. So I can either right click on this and say convert to measure, or convert to continuous, or I can just drag it down. And I drug it down and it converted it to a measure and a continuous. So if I double click this, that's not what was supposed to happen. It threw it into my text marks field. So let's try this. Let's see, watch this number change. So if you pull measure values over, let's take this part off first. Measure values and put it in your text field. You see how it's pulling over everything now, every one of your measures, including this number of records that you didn't even write. Now that we don't have headers, we know that we want to drag measure names to the columns. So that actually shows us every measure and all of their names. And I wanted to see how this changed as we selected down the line. I'm putting them in order. They are already in order of the calculation. Selected measure, see, this is one where we didn't have that correct because it's actually pulling in the sales. So if I go to this, it should be the discount. It's always very important to double check your stuff. And it really helps if when you're copying a field, make sure you change everything. Here I still have that we're using the choose your dimension. You'll see that now if I moved it to this, now my measure will match the discount because that's 1. So I want to fix this and say selected measure and tag nabbit. So now that I do that, I see that it matches up perfectly. Let's go back to region, and you can see the selected measure matches sales. Now it matches discounts, profit, and quantity. So that, my friends, is how you make a dynamic parameter that shows the dimensions and measures. It's really turned 16 different visualizations into one. Otherwise, you would have to have one category visualization with discount, profit, quantity, and sales, and so forth and so on. So thank you very much for listening.